Stellaris has gone through so many radical changes over the years that I'm almost afraid to be making this video, since Paradox are probably going to overhaul the entire game as soon as I release this. But it is probably the most requested review for this channel, aside from, well, one mod in particular, so I think it's finally time to talk about it. So Stellaris is a Paradox 4X grand strategy game, which if you've watched basically any of my videos you'll be familiar with, but if not, basically this means that compared to your standard strategy games like Civilization, Stellaris is more in-depth with its mechanics. Like, really in-depth with its mechanics. The good news for newcomers is that I've always felt that Stellaris is very approachable compared to some other grand strategy games. And since I've already made videos about Europa Universalis and Hearts of Iron 4, I'll be making a few comparisons to them, but I'll try and keep things open in case you're new to the genre. Now, fair warning, this is actually the Paradox game that I've played the least of, only a measly 300 hours or so. And honestly, the reason for this is a personal preference. I just prefer the World War II or Middle Age settings rather than the space one. But I wanted to mention this in case I say some rookie stuff during the review. Okay, so I'm going to give a rundown of the core gameplay, the writing, the music and all that throughout this video, but for now I want to start at the very beginning and build from there. Also, to keep things simple, I played a bunch of campaigns without any DLC installed, just so this review reflects the base game, and I'll bring up DLC stuff later on in its own section. With all that out of the way, let's get going. Every game in Stellaris has you start in a randomly generated galaxy, created based on parameters you set. These include the number of star systems, how easy it is to travel around, how many other empires exist, all the way down to when some mid and late game content triggers, as well as the end date of the game itself. So the first time you boot up Stellaris and go to start a game, you'll be given a list of possible nations to play as. These are decently diverse, including the Commonwealth of Man, a militaristic empire based on humans, as well as the Blorg, a meme from the game's pre-release streams who are a species so lonely that they've turned to militarism to force empires to be their friends. On top of these presets though, you can also create your own empire. And part of creating your OC is gameplay related, while other parts are just for storytelling, like deciding their name and writing their backstory. I'm going to run through all the steps now just so you get an idea of what level of depth is involved in it, and this should also highlight how diverse the random AI nations you'll encounter can be. So the first few steps for making your empire are very basic. Select what they look like from a list of portraits, name them, set up a backstory, and choose the name formats of leaders and ships. Next up we have traits, which apply to the main species within your empire. So even if they migrate outside your empire, they'll still have all these traits, regardless of what empire they end up in. These are pretty open-ended and you can pick a total of 4 to begin with, though you'll only be able to pick that many if you take some debuffs as well, because there's a secondary point balancing system. Basically, some of these traits are buffs, like having your pops naturally be good soldiers or having them be better at a certain type of research, while others are debuffs, such as having naturally shorter lifespans for your empire's leaders. Better effects cost more, so your empire's population won't naturally be amazing at everything, though there are of course ways to adjust this through research and augmentations later on. Following on from that is setting your species' climate preferences and naming their home system and starting world. You can even set up what kind of star system you begin the game in, including starting in our own solar system. Next up are origins, which are the event that caused your nation to enter space. These can range from story flavor to having game impact early on. So some examples are basic, like your planet formed one nation and enters space as a unified state, with higher starting population and a happy planet. Others are more exotic though, like you're a lost colony of another empire, or a space gateway at the edge of your solar system serves as an ominous shadow over your young spacefaring empire. The next point is another big impact option for your empire: ethics. These operate on a wheel system where any point on the wheel has its opposite on the other side of the wheel. So for example, militarism and pacifism are direct opposites. You're given 3 points, meaning you can have 2 ethics with one of them being an extreme version, such as fanatic xenophobia. Each ethic will unlock and block certain actions within the game, so for example, fanatic pacifists can't declare war on anyone, while fanatic xenophobes can enslave xeno races. One of the last main things in empire creation is what kind of government you have. This will depend a bit on your ethics, but you have your standard democracies with elections, monarchies, elective monarchies, dictatorships, and that kind of thing. There are different versions based on your ethics, meaning that while you might have 2 systems that are ruler for life setups, they give different buffs to your empire that are appropriate for your empire's ethics. Wrapping this up, you can even set your advisor voiceover depending on which DLCs you have.
The workers of all planets will unite.
Before finally we have flag creation and setting up your first ruler. This whole section was kind of long, but hopefully you'll see that empire creation is a really solid and pretty customizable part of the game, and I actually had a pretty fun time creating some empire types that I wouldn't normally play as for this review. I should also note that it's possible through war and internal pressure for an empire to shift its ethics, but most other features are stagnant except for a few events being able to change things up. Such as that time I had a local mutation within my empire descend into space Northern Ireland as the two subspecies that had evolved tried to erase each other. Anyway, once you've completed your first empire and almost definitely decided to commit space genocide, the game begins, leaving you with a starting planet, a construction ship, a small military fleet, and a research ship. The game tutorial is pretty solid and can help you get past the early learning curve that I know plagues a lot of grand strategies, but while you get used to the many menus in the game, you'll slowly start exploring nearby star systems, claiming them for your empire, and exploiting any resources you find. When you're experienced with the game, this early part is simple and mostly about claiming as much land as possible and making sure you control any choke points in the local hyperlanes. There is a fun rush for the new world element to early game, though honestly it's not too interesting on repeat playthroughs. Eventually though, your young spacefaring empire will run into a ship that you don't recognize, the first evidence of aliens. And here is where your empire's ethics will come face to face with another empire's philosophies. Are you two peaceful nations looking for friends, two empires who respect each other's relative strength, or are you fanatic militarists looking for war and they're fanatic spiritualists ready to force conversion on you? There's even options to allow your previous empires to appear, which is always really fun. Now obviously the game opens up a lot when you have other empires to deal with, so I'm going to run through a lot of the core mechanics now in no real order. Usually with these kind of games, I'm not too interested in diplomacy, but I actually did play a game while I was getting footage as a fanatic pacifist xenophobic empire. And what they would do is befriend their neighbours, convince them to swear loyalty in exchange for advanced research, and then integrate them into our empire. Once they were in, I'd take their land and purge their population. Now this didn't make me any friends in the Galactic Assembly, but I was surprised how much fun I had on a diplomacy-centric run. It definitely pairs well with turtling if you want to go for an evil space Switzerland thing. In general though, there's nothing crazy in this game diplomacy wise compared to other strategy games, just your usual trade, research and migration deals. Tech however is where Stellaris kills it. The actual core concept for it is pretty standard for a strategy game. You generate research points through buildings, with some planets and stars producing them too. Research itself is split into three main categories and you have science leaders for each. But the real strength that a space game like this has is that the tech is always really ambitious. Early game you'll be discovering stuff like more efficient mining or electricity generation, but pretty quickly you'll be discovering shit like psionic soldiers or how to turn any planet into a literal paradise. There's rare tech such as special engine types, as well as dangerous technologies, such as building advanced robots to work for your planets, or giving your ships combat AI who are programmed to fear death. Because of course, giving your giant planet-sized ship a fear of death will never backfire on you. Speaking of ships actually, over the years I've played a fair few 4X space games like Endless Space, and the feature that I've always adored is the vehicle designer. Honestly, the types of ships you make won't make your empire broken or anything, but getting to design your fleet of ships and watching your empire's tiny 3-ship navy swell up to several hundred with advanced shields, armor and weapons is very fun. There's definitely a part of my brain that loves those idle games where you just get to watch numbers go up, and that's definitely set off here watching my ships get upgraded. A huge factor of why I love ship combat in Stellaris is that since all the ships are full 3D models, you can zoom in on them and pan around as they fly, meaning that watching your navies go to war is always really fun. A lot of other grand strategies don't render anything close to this level of detail, so I definitely think that it's a big selling point for getting invested in your empire in Stellaris. Now I touched on this a bit during the tech section, but something that makes Stellaris a bit more interesting than a lot of grand strategy games is the amount of events that can occur. Basically, when you're exploring a system, you can find an anomaly. Some sensors aren't acting normally, or you spot an object that requires more investigating. So after sending a scientist to investigate, you'll trigger an event. These usually have some consequence, like helping research, giving you materials, or, if you're unlucky, killing your scientist. Well, your empire can only assume they're dead, you never did find a body. Some of these events are part of larger event chains, and I'll say this is where Stellaris hammers home its strong writing. The writing on some of these event chains is really engaging and interesting science fiction. There's hundreds of unique events, but stumbling across ones you've never seen before can be a rabbit hole as you're sucked into these unexpected short stories. My all-time favourite event chain was actually added as a free DLC called Horizon Signal. And as a standalone story, I'd say it's incredible. So to be a relatively small part of Stellaris shows how much depth is in this game. I honestly don't want to spoil it, so all I'll say is, embrace it. It loves you too. When you're up late at night reading about the event your scientists found, or planning your next war, you'll really get to like the soundtrack in this game. There's a lot of songs here, and they range from eerie open tracks that reflect the vastness of space, to up-tempo synth-heavy songs that suit a technologically advanced space empire, down to these organs that carry the weight and drama of a war in the stars. The soundtrack is probably one of the clear examples of how being able to break away from historical settings allowed Paradox and the grand strategy genre to stretch itself into something truly special. I know that Stellaris is building off the heritage of a lot of 4X space games, but I feel it does a lot to make the genre its own. Finally, before we get into all the DLC, I want to talk about one last part of the game: Fallen Empires. You have many of these representing different ethics, but the gist is, a fallen empire is an old and far more advanced empire that for one reason or another gave up. They stopped trying to get new land, and basically view every empire as ants, not caring about your existence at all. One day though, several hundred years into the game, they might decide to care again. And if they're the kind of empire who would exterminate ants, you better hope that you spent your time in space catching up to them. The reason I love Fallen Empires, beyond how much I enjoy the concept in general, is actually because I've often had games of Hearts of Iron or Europa Universalis where I've eliminated any real threat to me, but I haven't finished out the campaign I'm playing. So a lot of the fun from the challenge of the game is just gone. With Stellaris, you will eventually overcome your local neighbours, but you'll still have the Fallen Empires ominously waiting within their old worlds. And Fallen Empires aren't the only late game issue. Depending on your settings at the start of the campaign, you will face a powerful endgame crisis. There's a handful of these that are basically different flavours of the Reapers from Mass Effect, but the gist is that there's always something coming and it wants you dead. I'd love to get into more details on these, but it's finally time for the DLC deep dive. This is a Paradox game, so prepare for a decently long DLC talk. I think I'm getting better at doing these more efficiently, so it shouldn't be too long though. And normally I go over DLCs in order of release, though here there's a bunch of them that fit into smaller groups, so I'll go over a bunch of similar minor DLCs and then I'll hit up the big ones. So, currently there are 4 species packs. Now in base game Stellaris, your species is just an aesthetic choice, meaning that it has no gameplay effect and is just for role playing. These packs, however, introduce new species types and can give them unique gameplay mechanics relating to their species, which on the surface I think sounds very cool. That is what I would say, except that the first pack, Plantoids, didn't add anything except species pictures and new models for ships, for the price of €8. While editing this video, Paradox have announced a new team that's going to work on free updates to the game, and this includes patching up some of these DLCs. So I'll leave in my complaints for now since they are currently true and could stay that way in the future. Depending on when you watch this video, things might have changed. I'll leave details from the announcement on screen now. What I will say in its defense, when a pack is purely aesthetical changes, I don't think you can be upset that it exists, because if you want to buy it, then you'll buy it, and if not, at least you're not missing out on any cool gameplay. The second species pack, however, Humanoids, has more pictures and a new ship type again, but also added 3 voiceover packs for your AI assistant. I still don't think this is worth it, but I think it's similar to the Plantoids pack in that I don't really care about the features I'm missing out on. The third pack, Lithoids, started to be a bit more detailed, adding a new playstyle. Lithoids are basically living rocks, so don't eat plant-based material, instead consuming minerals. Because of this, they can live on basically any planet. The newest release though, Necroids, does add more content than the previous packs. So you have a new origin choice, new ethic choices for your civilization, such as being a death cult empire who gain power through sacrifices. There's a definite trend at these packs getting better as the years have gone on, but honestly, I think they botched the early ones a lot, and I think they should have gotten features equivalent to Necroids. I don't even really think that Necroid is worth €8, especially when we take a look at the next set of DLC. Story packs are the other common minor DLC type for Stellaris. So we have 4, Leviathan, Synthetic Dawn, Distant Stars, and Ancient Relics. These all have a bit more going on and are €10 each. So first up is Leviathans, and this pack actually does add a lot. You get 8 large space guardians, including sentient clouds and old machines. In general, they make the galaxy more interesting and vibrant, and usually are something you'll take on mid-game to get various tech and buffs. On top of that, Leviathan adds 3 small factions called Enclaves. These are groups that you can interact with and include an artist troupe who you can fund, or traders who you can get rare resources from. And then, as if this pack didn't add enough, you get the War in Heaven, which is basically when one fallen empire awakes, there's a chance that a second one will awaken to begin a massive war, turning the rest of the smaller empires mostly into satellites in a galaxy-spanning conflict. These kind of wars can happen in the base game, but they're just treated as normal wars without a bunch of the flavor events happening. Comparing this pack, which costs €10, to the species packs that cost 8, actually makes this one look like an incredible bargain, which I wouldn't be shocked if this is actually just sly marketing. Though I should note that Leviathans is probably my favourite of the minor DLCs. Next up is Synthetic Dawn, which allows you to play as Robotic Empire. This of course means all your population are built in factories instead of being born, and you don't need food to survive. And compared to Leviathan, this pack is just much more focused. Personally, getting to play as an empire whose backstory is basically being Skynet, going to space, and instantly starting wars with every empire you meet was pretty fun. Basically, this is what I wanted species packs to be like, giving you real depth to new playstyle. Or here where you actually get 3 or 4 new playstyles. You can even play as an empire of humans living symbiotically with robot caretakers to show you the kind of depth that's in this pack. Third on the list is Distant Stars, and honestly this is a bit weaker than the rest, but it adds 4 new guardians, lots of new events and anomalies, and its main gimmick is L-gates, which are gateways that teleport you to a constellation of stars just beyond the known galaxy. These can trigger one of 4 events, including an endgame crisis. And while this pack is definitely interesting, I personally prefer ones with more replayability in terms of cool mechanics. Finally, for story packs we have Ancient Relics. This adds archaeological digs which can result in uncovering unique items that can trigger certain buffs for your empires. The digs themselves are made up of a bunch of interesting short stories that are a lot of what I love about Stellaris. Though similar to Distant Stars, I feel this pack doesn't do anything crazy to justify the cost. Right, we're on to the last few DLCs, and these are the major ones. There's 5 of them and they all cost €20 normally. That's right, this game has €100 of major DLC. They go on sale pretty often, and I recommend you only buy them when they are on sale. I won't mention everything that each pack does, but I'll hit up everything that I think is interesting. These DLCs are in general very focused, which means if you like certain aspects of the game and don't care about other parts, it'll be easier to pick and mix what you want. First up is Utopia. And honestly, when Utopia first came out, it was a really big upgrade to the game. Thankfully, some elements of it have made their way into the base game, like the Ascension perks, so you can get a taster for them now. But I still think that it has some big things which I think make it worth it. So, Utopia adds megastructures. So when your planet gets overpopulated and there's no room left to claim without a big war, you can build halo rings or space station habitats. It even adds things like Dyson spheres to steal power from suns. On top of that, you have Ascension perks, and they are incredible. They are basically a set of powerful buffs that you can pick up over time as your empire ascends to a truly mature and powerful space empire. This was originally added in this DLC, and other DLCs add more perk options. Some of them are basic buffs, while others are crazy good, like ones to turn your entire empire synthetic. You'll see a lot of people say that this DLC is essential, and it's hard to disagree because so much of it is a big bonus to literally any playstyle. Next up is Apocalypse, which is the War DLC. This adds in the ability to make a Colossus ship. These are planet killers and give you a few ways to wipe out entire planet populations or even crack the planet itself open. On top of that, you also get a Titan ship class, which is just another big military ship. And then finally, some roaming pirate mercenary factions got added. They fly around and can be hired as mercenaries, and sometimes they'll demand payment for you on threat of attack. This DLC really lives on the 2 new ship types, which I don't think are worth the €20, but I do admit that they are super cool to see in action. Following on from that, we have Megacorp, which is the trading DLC. This one includes the option to run a mega corporation empire, and this is a pretty interesting way to play the game. It's definitely the big change that you'd want to see in a DLC that costs this much, and it lets you build offices on other empires' planets for trade power, as well as letting you build planet-spanning slums.
Megacities.
Traveling trader factions also got added, as well as more megastructures, a galactic Amazon employee market, and the usual music and ascension perks. Overall, while I don't usually play trade in most strategy games because it's never in-depth enough for me, I do like the scope of changes here compared to Apocalypse. The second newest DLC is Federations. And honestly, I will give credit to Paradox, the bulk of this DLC, i.e. the Federations themselves, made it into the game for free, and the version in the base game is really solid and doesn't feel like a half-baked system. This DLC adds a bit more depth to the Federation system itself, adding things like trade leagues and marshal packs, and then a new mega ship type called the Juggernaut. These are basically giant ships that can handle repairs and upgrades on the move, while also being lethal weapon platforms. This is definitely a strange addition for the Federation DLC, but they are very cool. The last main feature it adds is a new species origins, which I really like. Though the earlier DLCs added 1 or 2 each, so getting 7 here is cool, but it isn't an insane unique feature. Overall, this is a good pack, if not a little unfocused, but I think it's one of the better ones. Finally, we have Nemesis. This pack adds espionage, and honestly, I don't like it. Base game espionage is basically pointless, only being used to get map information, and while the stuff added through buying the DLC is lackluster to me, maybe it's something to do for Turtle Empires or certain roleplay scenarios, but I just couldn't get into it. There are promises on the store page that you can become the Crisis, which sounds incredibly interesting, but realistically the amount of flavour it adds isn't worth the cost of this DLC to me. You unlock new subtypes for ships and bonuses for waging war as part of a system linked to being evil. This DLC is just nothing special, especially when €20 can buy several entire games I've reviewed on this channel. As usual, I'll throw in the DLC disclaimer that's been in every Paradox game review I've made. Paradox do release big free patches alongside DLC, so I'm usually excited to see what the patches have to offer. Though with Stellaris it's been incredibly hit or miss, with great stuff like Federations and weak stuff like the spy system. Overall, Stellaris has been the game that's been overhauled the most out of any Paradox game, and I know that some of the overhauls have been trade-offs between balance and complexity, meaning that some options and interesting mechanics had to be cut. But this review kind of ends where it started. Stellaris is full of these solid mechanics, incredible music, and amazing science fiction writing, so I understand why people love the game. Ultimately though, I think for me, I prefer the small details of real-world maps that EU4, Hearts of Iron, and Crusader Kings all live in. And the vastness of space, while opening up all these science fiction options, ultimately leaves your empire occupying great stretches of empty, open space, which just hasn't captured my imagination as much, even with all the compliments I've given this game. I definitely recommend trying it out, and you'll know yourself if the setting interests you. But I am hoping one day to see Stellaris 2 that can expand on the concepts brought in through the DLCs, but tie the world together with the years of patchwork systems in a smoother way. Well, with this review done, I've covered a lot of the big Paradox games, though I'll eventually get around to some of the other ones, and maybe an updated review for some of them eventually. I always say that I want to get more videos out, but there's always something that gets in the way. Work on the next video has begun, and the next few reviews are lined up, but feel free to suggest stuff in the comments. Until next time, remember to like, comment, subscribe, and maybe even check out some of my older videos. A bunch of them are having their first anniversaries right now, and honestly they are looking very stale already. But until next time, I'll see you.